these tortoises are absolutely the ecosystem engineers. They're incredible grazers, they're nutrient cyclers, they're seed dispersers. Also just mechanically, they're the largest creatures on these islands.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm very happy and delighted to be here with Celina Chien, who's a conservationist and science communicator known particularly for her work with the giant tortoises of the Indian Ocean, specifically the Aldabra giant tortoises. Now, I was lucky enough to be introduced to Celina by Tom Kaplan, who established Panthera, which is the world's only large conservation organization devoted to protecting and rewilding big cats and small cats and wild cats of all kinds. And Tom has a connection with the Seychelles, has been a supporter of the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance, and he suggested I chat to you, Celina, to talk about this amazing species and about the islands that they inhabit. So thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so happy to spotlight these gentle giants and get more attention on them.
Well, we got really lucky as a family when Tom invited us to the Seychelles. None of us, my kids, my wife, none of us had ever been to the Seychelles before. So we grabbed that opportunity and we spent 10 days in those islands earlier this year. So it was a hell of an adventure for us all. And almost the first thing that happened was the lady who greeted us said, "Do you guys want to see some giant tortoises?" And there they were. I just could not believe my eyes, the size of these things. They were like a small motor car or something. These huge tortoises milling about in the sunshine under some trees beyond where Tom's house is. And immediately a fascination was born. I don't know when you first came across this species yourself.
Well, I also came across the species at the exact same spot you did. I actually, studying biology and studying tropical conservation, I had always known about the tortoises. I had always known about, their namesake, Aldabra atoll, which as a conservationist and also as a biologist, it's really the holy grail of one of those places. And the Seychelles is also such a special place. I'm sure you're also very familiar with islands and island conservation and island biodiversity. There's so much there, and they're really like these repositories for the weird and wonderful creatures that haven't necessarily kind of persisted on the continents. And so I always knew about these giant tortoises and always really wanted to see them, and had the incredible opportunity to go to visit Tom in Seychelles, but also to see the incredible work of his organization that he champions there, called the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance. And that's also where I encountered these incredible animals, which are enormous. They're like tanks. They're even bigger than anyone could imagine. And they're also so kind and so gentle, and one of the few creatures that you can encounter in the world that are just unafraid and open and very curious to come towards you. It's a very special privilege to be able to meet one.
Well, I found exactly the same. I mean, for me, it was a kind of very moving experience to watch my littlest children, who are kind of 1, 2.5 years old, getting close to these tortoises and resting their hands on their giant shells and on their necks, and they were just interested in us and kind of pleased to see us. And then the little baby ones are just so cute because they're breeding them in. And we went to another island, which is famous because a British conservationist had bought the island and restored nature there and removed invasive species and removed infrastructure and brought the tortoises back and had refused some extraordinarily valuable offers from various potentates who wanted to own that island. And instead, he decided that this would be a nature preserve into the future. And the breeding was successful, and these little tiny tortoises was amazing. But I had on the podcast Carl Jones about 9 months ago. Carl Jones is a very famous conservationist who led the campaign and the effort to restore the unique Mauritius kestrel back to abundance, a species that was on the brink of extinction. He spent a lot of his conservation career on the island of Mauritius. And in the podcast, he described to me, and I kind of quote here, palm savannas stretching across the island with hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of giant tortoises grazing and moving across them. And of course, the island's famous for dodos and other missing species, and the kestrel just about clung on and is now recovering. But I couldn't get that out of my head, the idea that this giant tortoise that I saw recently in the Seychelles was once abundant across the islands of the Indian Ocean, including the big islands. Do we have any idea today of kind of the extent of their range, the extent of their population, as compared with the numbers that remain?
Well, no, we don't have a lot of that data and that information. What we can extrapolate from are from the records of sailors. And we know that these giant tortoises, they were on Mauritius, Rodrigues, even Madagascar, across the Indian Ocean, and unfortunately, largely hunted to extinction on most of the other islands, and really only survived on Aldabra, this one coral atoll in the outer islands of the Seychelles. And what you can maybe kind of guess what it looked like, exactly as Carl described, is there are fields and what we call tortoise turf, which are these grasslands essentially of over 20 different species of vegetation and grasses that the tortoises are stewards of. But you look out over the islands and there are hundreds. There should be hundreds of thousands. And on Aldabra, there are approximately 100,000 tortoises. And that's quite Aldabra is a fragmented island atoll with different patches, and a lot of these islands, at least the coralline islands, so not the granitic islands, they don't have sources of fresh water. So their populations didn't necessarily explode to the millions. So what we can extrapolate from is Aldabra right now, and there are around 100,000 tortoises roaming around freely there, and their population is kind of now in check and in balance and surviving.
And of course, they're the source population for the reintroductions that we're going to come on to. But it seems reasonable, therefore, that Carl's suggestion of millions of giant tortoises on the the palm savannas of Mauritius might have been the case. And so these giant tortoises wandering Mauritius and the other islands of the Indian Ocean had never met people until the Europeans arrived. And then I guess they just harvested them up and kept them alive in the bottom of their ships as food for those long journeys. Certainly the Galapagos giant tortoises were harvested in that way. It was because it was a ready source of meat that would last for weeks or months on end. These tortoises are very hardy and they survive, such that there were quite literally none left. Is that correct? Just the Aldabra atoll.
Yes, exactly. And it's exactly that situation where these tortoises could live for a very long time on the ships with no food or water and very little care, and provided a great source of food for sailors. But yes, they were largely extirpated from most of the islands and just remain on Aldabra.
And then the ecological ramifications of that are not fully understood, are they? Because this was the keystone herbivore species for these islands in this ocean.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And as is the keystone species, they're either the top of the trophic level and are the predators, or quite often, ecosystem engineers are the large herbivores. And these tortoises are absolutely the ecosystem engineers. They're incredible grazers, they're nutrient cyclers, they're seed dispersers. Also just mechanically, they're the largest creatures on these islands. So the way they move through the habitat is changing the structure of the vegetation. And so we don't really know the true consequences, also because there are so many interacting consequences. Island biodiversity and island ecosystems are so sensitive. And it's not just the tortoises that were removed from these islands, but invasive species arrived, human settlements arrived, the climate has changed, sea levels are changing. And that's also why it's very difficult to disentangle all these different threads. But what we can measure is when we do reintroduce these tortoises onto islands, how do they change the system, and how do they change the vegetation, and how can they support the rewilding, and not just, the introduction of these animals, but also supporting the elimination of invasive plant species, because they just eat them all very efficiently, and also supporting other native species and defining those niches again.
So let's talk a little bit about the geography of the Seychelles, just to orientate ourselves. By the way, I learned recently that the Seychelles are named after Viscount Jean Moreau de Seychelles, who was the French Minister of Finance during the reign of Louis XV. And Victoria, of course, the capital of the Seychelles, named after Britain's Queen Victoria. And I think she's still celebrated each year today because the Seychelles were used as a place in which slaves rescued from the slave trade were brought to live free by the British Navy, which I find quite an interesting, as a Brit, I find it quite interesting that our Queen from 140 years ago is still celebrated annually in those islands. So you talked about coral islands and you talked about granitic islands. Can you just explain to me briefly an overview of the geography of these tortoise islands?
Absolutely. So I'm no geologist, but how this interacts with biology is so fascinating. Unlike other islands, remote ocean islands, a lot of them, like the Galapagos, are volcanic, whereas the Seychelles, they are some of the oldest land masses in the world. So they're not volcanic islands, and the land is, from the old tectonic plates of Gondwana. And so you have the granitic islands, which are kind of called the inner islands, the larger islands that with most of the human settlements and inhabitants, and these have extraordinary mountains and fresh sources of fresh water, whereas you also have the outer islands, which are the coral atolls, the coralline islands, which are much more isolated, have no human settlements because, quite frankly, people could not survive there, and no sources of fresh water. And these islands, the outer islands like Aldabra and Assumption, the quote, Aldabra Islands, they are so isolated from human activities that is the reason why they've remained as pristine as they are. And Aldabra is often quoted to be, I think it was Sir David Attenborough that quoted Aldabra to be one of the last remaining, surviving treasures of this planet. And truly, even though it already has a few invasive species, is still so remarkably intact from a biodiversity perspective. It really feels like Jurassic Park.
and we're going to talk about in a moment your own campaign to keep Aldabra that way. Mm-hmm. But Aldabra is interesting for being the source population of Aldabra tortoises for reintroductions across the islands. So theoretically, could these tortoises be reintroduced to all of those islands, whether they are granitic or coral islands?
Yes, absolutely.
And when did that start? So when was the first reintroduction or translocation of giant tortoises in the Indian Ocean?
Well, there are obviously the more systematized efforts that started more recently, like with the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance being the tip of the spear of, monitoring those tortoises that were reintroduced and tagging them, microchipping them, measuring the ecological impacts of when they did arrive, and understanding what is the, density of the population is really key. So understanding how many tortoises is too little or too much. So IOTA has done some amazing work there in the last few years. But some of the reintroductions, and most I would say, are actually accidental. So a lot of them, the reintroduction of giant tortoises to Round Island in Mauritius is seen as one of the most successful rewilding efforts. And, that was over 50 years ago, and probably not entirely intentional. And also long before that, you had people who were fascinated by these animals and just wanted to have them on their islands, and brought those tortoises over. And those tortoises mated and set up small populations. And so, yes, it's similar to a lot of kind of guerrilla rewilding efforts in other places. A lot of it has been accidental.
But it worked. So where those accidental reintroductions took place, those tortoises established themselves, they bred, and they created trophic cascades. Carl Jones, in that earlier podcast, talked a little bit about Round Island, and he talked about the changing plant dynamics and different trees growing that hadn't grown for a very long time on that island, and the opening up of grassy areas, and his strong desire that the Mauritian government sanction a reintroduction of giant tortoises to areas of the main island of Mauritius, which hasn't yet happened as far as I'm aware.
Mm-hmm. And what's really fascinating about Round Island, I mean, that was, I think, around 50 years ago when the tortoises were brought there. But what's fascinating is that you've even seen the palm trees migrating up mountainsides. So often seeds will disperse downward unless they're eaten by tortoises. And so the tortoise reintroductions have allowed for palm trees to start growing at higher elevations. And it really has completely changed the vegetation landscape.
He indicated, Carl, that there might have been two different categories of Indian Ocean tortoises, which were the ones that graze upwards or browse, the saddleback tortoises, and then those which have a more rounded shell, which predominantly graze the grass beneath them. And only one of those remains. Is that right?
Oh, I would say actually there were other species of giant tortoise in the Indian Ocean that the now remaining Aldabra tortoise, when introduced to islands like Mauritius, they're acting as a proxy for a now extinct species. So that is also something to keep in mind, that yes, it's rewilding and reintroduction, but in some cases, this specific species of tortoise may not have ever existed there, and they're acting as a proxy for a now extinct species.
So I'm totally comfortable with that. And one of the podcast episodes we had was with Mark Day, who's in charge of the Aldabra rewilding project, the great grassland, the golden steppe of Kazakhstan. And they were talking about bison. And the best bison, ecologically speaking, would be the North American plains bison, because the original steppe bison doesn't exist anymore. It's probably more closely genetically related to the European bison, which has staged an extraordinary comeback. But that's a woodland animal. And there's a whole chunk of the conservation movement that is very purist and doesn't want North American plains bison on the Central Asian steppe. The same debate around mustangs and burros fulfilling the role of ancient equines in the American Southwest. I'm totally cool with using proxies. I think conservation science can get itself too caught up in purity and caution and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the organized reintroduction of tortoises, because I've been getting the newsletters now of the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance, and it's pretty amazing the scale at which they're doing things. I saw 50 tortoises were taken from Mahe Island to North Island just in this most recent newsletter that they sent out the weekend. So tell me about that. How has this gathered pace, and you know, what's the scale in terms of number of islands that have now got tortoises back after a long time, and what's the potential? Like, how far could this go?
Well, what's super exciting is obviously IOTA is based in Seychelles, and we're starting in the Seychelles. But the vision is across all of the Indian Ocean. So supporting reintroduction efforts in Madagascar and Mauritius and Rodrigues, and possibly even, one day Reunion. And I think that the 50 tortoises that were transported, I think that's the largest ever translocation that IOTA has ever performed, and hopefully with many more ahead. And what I find so interesting, and it's a point that you touched on previously when we were talking about, accidental reintroductions and how they do work. And what's so fascinating and great about this species is that, yes, it may not be the exact same species, but it performs the same function. And we're all about, functional diversity and restoring those ecosystem functions. But they're also so easy to reintroduce. And there's actually very little behavioral preparation before and after. For example, in my other role, I'm on the board of Panthera as well. And we know big cats and large predators are used to rewild areas all the time. And it's very, very difficult, if not almost impossible, to take a captive predator and reintroduce it into the wild. And with IOTA, of course, some of the source population for the introductions are from Aldabra, but a lot of the source population as well are kind of rescued tortoises that used to be in private hands. So a lot of tortoises that were on private property who now can live free, and being able to scale that and have these large herds, 2 to 3 herds at a time, populating new islands across the Indian Ocean, really.
So do you have a sense of the kind of number of islands that have already got their tortoises back, roughly speaking? And just to give me an idea of how many islands used to have tortoises and could have them back. I mean, are we talking dozens of islands or hundreds of islands?
Well, in the Seychelles, there are 115 islands just alone. So I would say I don't have the the exact numbers, but I would say in the scale of the hundreds, just because this is just one country in a very large ocean, and the potential is vast.
And can these tortoises survive on very small islands? So some of the islands I visited during my 10 days there as Tom's guest were pretty tiny. I mean, like it was kind of a forested hill sticking out of the sea with a ring of beaches. Is that enough for giant tortoises to survive on?
It is. I mean, it is. But what's interesting about the tortoises is, of course, it all depends on the population size. And then that also goes into genetics and the genetic viability of smaller populations. And it also entirely depends really on the source of fresh water, because you can have huge islands that don't have any fresh water that can support a much smaller population of tortoises, or you can have tiny islands that have, a small little stream or a waterfall, and that will keep the population up and running. But also what's really cool about some of these coralline atolls is, like Aldabra, it's many islands together. And what's really cool is seeing some of these tortoises swim across. If the distance is small enough, these tortoises, which are, land dwelling and don't have any fins and flippers, they can swim across small distances of water to kind of colonize new islands or repopulate new islands.
Have they been known to float across larger distances?
Not to my knowledge.
And what about invasive species? Because the catalyst for dramatic recovery of Galapagos tortoises, one of the great conservation triumphs of the last century, has been the removal of especially rats, but also invasive pigs, and a whole bunch of different species will prey upon baby giant tortoises or eat their eggs. And so is that not a prerequisite? At the very least, removing invasive rodents must be a prerequisite for reintroducing giant tortoises, or is that not the case?
It's not actually a prerequisite. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with how challenging, time-consuming, and expensive it is to eradicate small mammals off of an island. And actually, even on Aldabra, where we have the healthiest and largest population of giant tortoises, there are rats and cats on Aldabra, and yet the tortoises persist. However, I would say the black hole of knowledge there is that there's very little information and very little ability for researchers to understand the early life stages of tortoises. So obviously where these mammals are having a huge impact on their life cycle is as their eggs or if they're hatchlings. And because they're so hard to find, you really only see the tortoises once they're very old and very big. So that is definitely a big question mark. And with the reintroductions, it's not a prerequisite currently, but the tortoises are really helpful in removing other invasive species, particularly plant species. And so they're also a great tool that we can use to rewild other islands. But it is a huge, huge issue in Seychelles, at least, and in many, many places, the risk of introducing new invasive species, but also removing the already persistent invasive species.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. I spent time on the main island of Mahe, where the capital is, and was told that there had once been a big population of giant tortoises there. And the reason why it wasn't lined up for reintroduction on that island as a species is because people would grab them. And we were told they would take them as pets or potentially even as food. And whilst a certain number of people on the main island do have pet tortoises, no wild reintroduction, even in the national parks that exist on the island, has been considered, which struck me as a bit odd. The idea that it couldn't be done there, because Mahe seems pretty lush and green, and it's a big island.
Well, this is, the threat of the illegal wildlife trade is also one of the biggest pressures on the Aldabra tortoise. They are an extremely popular species in the exotic pet trade. And so it's not just people who want to have them as pets in Seychelles, but who would export them. And I like that you touch on, yes, Mahe is very big and it's very lush. And even in the parks, there is space for them to be reintroduced. But, as is the case with all rewilding efforts, all reintroduction efforts, if there isn't the habitat, if there isn't sufficiently large, healthy, and protected habitat, reintroduction efforts are a distant dream, and particularly on islands. And so islands are really like microcosms for the greater conservation struggles that we face everywhere, all over the world. They just happen more intensely and more quickly on islands because we're limited for space. And particularly in Seychelles, where the islands, there's space is being competed for between either, new developments, inhabitants of those islands, rising sea levels, but then also all the usual pressures on biodiversity and healthy habitat. And so, at least on a big island like Mahe, I think there's the pressures are still too great to ensure successful and long-term reintroductions.
What's the view of the government of Seychelles around giant tortoises and rewilding generally? Are they supportive of the efforts of IOTA around reintroduction? Do they take it seriously, the threat of tortoises being taken into the wildlife trade?
I would say the Seychelles government is largely, seen as an international spearhead of conservation, whether that's ocean conservation or the conservation of their super unique biodiversity. And they are supportive of the giant tortoise reintroductions. Also, you can see it reflected in the culture and in the people in Seychelles. Everyone knows about their tortoises. Everyone is very proud of their tortoises. And I think that is by far the greatest conservation win you can have, is people being really proud and connected to the nature that they have on their doorstep.
Yeah, and Seychelles was the first country to comply with the International Fisheries Transparency Standard, which was kind of a big deal for people working on all of that. And by the way, I urge you to go and see the new Attenborough film Ocean. If you haven't already seen it, it's just mind-blowingly good and takes you right down into the abyss and then brings you out into the sunlit uplands of what could be. Celina, how did you're a biologist, conservationist, you've grown up in various different places in the world, you're quite an international person. Now, how did you come to love the islands of the Indian Ocean and their tortoises, and particularly the Aldabra Islands?
I came to love them because I had the incredible privilege to visit them. And it's one of those places that once you go there, you can't really ever shake the bug. The Aldabra Islands in particular are the most pristine and extraordinary place that I have ever been. And I've been to some pretty incredible remote places to document biodiversity. But I also really care because they're threatened. One of the biggest threats to the Aldabra tortoises right now is not just the invasive species that threaten their island home, but also immediately an enormous luxury development that is being built on a neighboring island that could bring all of those invasive species, that could bring disturbance and waste and human activities that disrupt their behavior, that disrupt this pristine Jurassic Park-like peaceful paradise. And as soon as I saw that, I was galvanized in a way that I haven't really been in a long time to protect this place and to protect all of its inhabitants, not just the tortoises, but the 400 other species found nowhere else on Earth that call these islands home.
So in response to that threat, you set up the Friends of Aldabra. Mm-hmm. So what is that initiative? So
Friends of Aldabra is a youth-led campaign. We're a collective of conservationists and artists and young people all over the world who are allies for Aldabra. We recognize that most people are never going to have the privilege to go there, but we found that this threat is immediately risking catastrophe to one of the most precious and pristine places left on Earth. And we've launched an enormous campaign to stop this luxury development from moving forward and stopping the construction, because even though the Seychelles government is a leader in some places, this is one of those cases where we are inviting them to really step up and walk the talk and protect the crown jewel of the nation's and also really the world's heritage in this island.
Well, I really hope and pray that Friends of Aldabra succeeds in its campaign and you stave off this development. Like you, I love nature. I'm fascinated by wildlife, have been since I was a kid. And I guess I have kind of two ways of experiencing connection with nature. One is hyperlocal, spending time in my patch. I love being outside. I love listening to the bird song changing throughout the year. I love participating in the rewilding and conservation work that we're doing and just walking in it, swimming in it, being in it. And then the second way is just knowing about these places that I most likely will never visit. Just knowing that they're out there, that people are fighting to save them, that they're getting better. These tortoises are being spread from Aldabra to other islands through the Indian Ocean, that there's a rewilding effort, a conservation effort that is really yielding results. Just knowing that it's out there, I think, is deeply fulfilling. Mm-hmm. And for that, I'm just so grateful to you, Celina, for everything you're doing in the Indian Ocean and for taking the time to come and talk to me on this podcast. You're amazing. They said you were a storyteller, and you really are. We need many, many more Celina Chiens. Thank you for taking the time to chat to me.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming equipped with such wonderful, exciting questions. And yes, thank you for spotlighting the tortoises and for Aldabra and for our fight for it.
So I urge anyone listening to this podcast to sign up to the newsletters of the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance. It's fantastic. And also to the newsletters of Friends of Aldabra, so you can follow and hopefully support Celina's campaign to keep that place pristine and wild. It says on Celina's bio that she's a storyteller, and what cooler story can there possibly be than the restoration of giant tortoises across the islands of the Indian Ocean? The Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance is just doing amazing work with translocations and protection and rewilding these extraordinary, remote, fascinating ecosystems. I'm so grateful to Celina for joining me on the podcast, and I just love what she's doing. If you enjoyed my conversation with Celina about giant tortoises in the Indian Ocean, please do spread the word about the podcast, share it with friends and colleagues, give us a like or a review. Check out our YouTube channel where we show some of the best bits and snippets from behind the scenes. Next time I'm going to be talking to Staffan Widstrand, a conservationist from Sweden who's working to foster coexistence with difficult wildlife, particularly wolves, but also bears, lynx and others in Sweden, where protections have in recent years been weakened and the hunting quotas seem to keep on going up, somewhat incomprehensibly, given that it's Sweden we're going to be talking about.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species, bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.